Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Um, Continuing on with the World War I story today. Yesterday we saw how the Schlieffen Plan was initiated by the Germans. They actually were making rapid progress to begin the war. And then came the First Battle of the Marne, where they were stopped, actually really close to Paris, by this rapid movement of French troops into position. Basically made it 25 miles outside of Paris or so before being stopped. What I want to do is pick up the story there and see kind of what happens. How does this deteriorate into trench warfare? And so after the First Battle of Marne, what you have is a pretty famous time period of World War I called the Race to the Sea. Basically, the idea was each side was trying to outflank the other. You can kind of get the sense of the fact that the Germans have been stopped, and what you end up happening is what you see is these efforts to outflank the other. Now that's a term used in warfare that means to make it around the end, and you sort of see this going back and forth through the early fall of 1914. And what ends up happening is this actually culminates in a couple of battles up here in Belgium. Probably most famously, the first Battle of Ypres. You can see it right here, Ypres, Ypres. And there's actually going to be a series of battles that take place there throughout the war. There's three of them, and they're pretty devastating. And just ruin the landscape, honestly. The scars of World War I are still there today. You can see them quite clearly from the air. You can, visit the former trenches and everything. But basically, neither side succeeded in actually making it around the edge of the other. And so what ends up happening is the whole thing just bogs down into trench warfare. It's very, very stagnant. It's what's called the Hindenburg Line. In this slide, what you can see are the various positions of the line. Notice this green line. That's actually the farthest advanced of the Germans in 1914. And see how close to Paris they got. But then what you end up seeing is that line retreating. You have a purple and a brown line. The brown line is maybe the one that's most indicative of the positioning of the line throughout the war, as that is technically called the Hindenburg Line, named after a German general named Paul von Hindenburg. This line is about 400 miles long, a little bit more than that actually, and it extends all the way from the English Channel or the North Sea here down to the Swiss Alps actually, and there's essentially almost no movement. They might gain a few miles and then lose a few miles. We'll talk about why the line moves the way it does a little bit later, but the experience of trench warfare during World War I was just awful. One of the things that's true about this geography is that it's very low-lying. They're actually called the Low Countries. Pretty flat, pretty low according to sea level. And that meant basically as soon as you started digging, you would end up with waterlogged trenches, even really before the rains came. But the rain in Northern Europe is a part of fall, winter, and spring. So just really a terribly waterlogged and dreary experience. But I want to get into detail on kind of how this happened. Why is it that it got to be so stagnant? And the reason can be traced to these new weapons. Here's what you have. You have generals and officers who were trained in sort of a bygone era. They were trained with strategies that worked for armies that were going up against weapons that had to be reloaded after every single shot. A rifle that you had to take 30 seconds to reload. Now, there were repeating rifles in the late 1800s, but nothing like the machine guns that you see in World War I. So what you end up seeing is old strategies going against new weapons. And the old strategies simply didn't work, especially offensively. This might sound strange, but the machine gun in particular was an extremely effective defensive weapon. And you can see in this upper left-hand corner that the machine guns of the day were not as mobile as what we might picture. So they were really effective if you put them in a foxhole or in a machine gun nest or a trench, and you could make sure that any approaching attack was pretty easily dealt with. The old Napoleon idea was that you would attack one single space in the line and try to overwhelm that space in the line by having more men there than they did. But when there's a machine gun, uh, the gunner can handle 100, 200 men attacking him if he has, you know, a good partner and is able to reload. And so all the offensive ideas were basically lost. They just didn't work. So other weapons started to be used and developed trying to break the stagnancy of how things had bogged down. Very famously, air forces became a part of the military for the first time. At first, really, they just used them for troop movements and scouting. But as things bogged down, there was less and less scouting to do, so they would use them for bombing raids. It actually developed very organically, which is a strange thing to say about war. But when pilots first went up, they were basically unarmed. And then they were like, well, I guess we could shoot at each other while we're up here, or I guess we could, hand drop bombs over the edge of the plane down on the trenches below. And so they started to think through doing things like that, mounting machine guns and so forth. Other ideas for breaking the stagnancy were like the tank. This is an early British tank. They were first used at the Battle of the Somme, and they had this idea that they could get across no man's land, the space between the trenches, effectively if they had armored vehicles. They had a few offensive capabilities with guns, but they would sort of protect troops as they went across no man's land. And they thought, okay, they could straddle the trenches too, and we could just keep going. We can get, more momentum. The tanks improved a lot during World War I, but were really not that effective. They broke down. The armor wasn't great. The artillery that was being used was really difficult to manage. And the tank's day will come during World War II, really. But during World War I, this was an idea. They thought we can maybe break the stagnancy. At the bottom, you see another effort, which is chemical warfare. I can't show you a picture of chemicals. So what I showed you here is people who have been attacked by chemical warfare. You can see that they are blind. I know that you can't see the picture that well. Let me move. Let me see if I can move myself here out of the way. There we go. This picture, you can see their eyes are covered and they have to hold on to each other because they've been blinded by the chemical weapons. And so the idea was, okay, we'll use chemical weapons to try to soften up the other line. Artillery is not a new weapon, but they were using it to the same way, trying to soften up the line as they would attack. In fact, they used to use what were called creeping barrages, and they would actually just have the artillery fall right in front of their men as they advanced. It's a pretty dangerous way of attacking, but they thought that would be really effective. So they would use this barrage that was, softening up the ground right in front of their men, and hopefully they could then, as soon as their men were at the trench ready to attack, they would stop the artillery barrage and their men would be in. All kinds of ideas trying to break the stagnancy. But the stagnancy remained for, well, basically 4 straight years. There's a little bit of movement, but not very much. And even on the seas, there was just this sort of war of attrition. You have the German U-boats trying to create like a blockade around England, trying to basically starve the island of England out. And the English were trying to do the same to the Germans, and they were just wearing each other down. That's the only strategy they could come up with, wearing each other down. In the meantime, the soldiers had a horrific experience in the trenches. You can see a picture of a trench here. These are French soldiers, actually. And the trenches are actually pretty elaborate by the end of the war. The Germans were very famous for their engineering of their trenches. If you haven't seen the movie 1917 and you are okay with war movies, that might be one worth seeing. I think that they really nailed the experience of trench warfare and really World War I to start with. But the trenches got more and more elaborate as the years went on because they were basically in them for all that time. I'm sorry about how difficult this picture is to look at, but this is what's called trench foot. I told you how the trenches were so wet. Well, these the wetness meant that the men's feet basically deteriorated over time. They used whale blubber and other efforts to try to keep their feet dry. There were like orders that they would change their socks twice a day and that sort of thing. But for some of them, it just was too much, and they really lost their feet to this trench foot. Um, another thing that another thing that they had to deal with were these trench rats. And notice how big they are. Millions of people were killed in the trenches during World War I, and they often just buried them right there in the trench. Or men and horses were left in no man's land because it was too dangerous to go get them. So you end up with all these corpses. I know it's kind of hard to talk about, but what that meant was the rat population would feed on it. And so a lot of people's deepest fears were not necessarily dying, but actually being wounded to the point where they couldn't fight the rats off. It's horrible to think about. World War I was horrible. The upper picture you have here, that's a picture of people trying to get the lice off. Trench lice were a real issue. They caused actually what was called trench fever. And these lice were just ubiquitous. So what they would do is they would actually rotate the men through the trenches. They would be at the front line for like a week or 2 weeks, and then they would go to the back and they would recuperate and get hot showers and a meal. And then they would be in the support trenches for a couple of weeks, and they would be the ones who were making sure that the front lines had food and so forth. And they just did these rotations. But as soon as you were back in the trenches, the trench lice were back. And they would actually use candles and try to like use the heat of the candle to get the trench lice out. The last thing I want to show you to talk about the experience of the trenches is actually with shell shock, and I have a video for you. Be patient with me while I cue it up here. This video kind of gives a good look at what many of the men actually experienced from how much shelling went on and the extreme stress. Let me play this for you. Let's see if this will... I think I should probably leave it like this so you could see it. So you can see extreme tremors that they experienced. A lot of it brought on by images or sounds that reminded them of being on the front lines. Some of them have really hard time walking. And some of them couldn't even interact. They're sort of locked inside themselves. They couldn't speak. They lost themselves. There's a famous phrase that comes out of this. It says, "In war, there are no unwounded soldiers." You know, many of these men who are suffering this way actually didn't have any physical wounds. So there was all kinds of strange theories that people came up with for, you know, what had caused this shell shock. But World War I is really the first war where they see it so thoroughly amongst the soldier population. But it still shows up in other places too. A lot of it was the stress of just sitting there waiting, in a sense, for something bad to happen. With World War II, it's much more mobile warfare, and they saw a little bit less of it. Now, they try to treat this, and some people did recover with age, but you could see this a really horrific experience fighting in World War I in the trenches. So what I want to do tomorrow then is talk about how do they eventually break free from this, but also a big part of that is the United States joining the war. Well, it's not a huge part of it, but it's a part of it. And so tomorrow I want to talk about why was the United States neutral at first, and then why did they join the war? And that will help us see eventually how this stagnancy broke. I'm going to be putting up a worksheet due Friday. I don't think it'll be too, confusing or anything, but let me know if you need any help or have any questions.